Arrogant MacArthur was always in trouble. He was called back to England twice to face charges, leaving Elizabeth to run things. Ultimately, he was declared insane.
There was a time when what are now the western suburbs could have been the eastern suburbs, because Arthur Phillip thought Parramatta, the place where the eels jump up, was ideal as a site for the capital.
In those days, it was actually Rose Hill, an area that abounded in the most brightly coloured parrots. And Phillip called them Rose Hillers, and for trivia lovers, that then became shortened to Rosellas. But it was not destined to become the capital. One of the main reasons, they say, is ships of the First Fleet couldn't sail up the Parramatta River beneath the overhanging trees. As you can see, there are still trees lining the bank today, but I doubt that the First Fleet would have had the same problem.
But it's history that Parramatta is regarded as the cradle of development anyway. Apart from Elizabeth Farm, that's perfectly obvious from the dominant position of the old government house here, the oldest public house in Australia. Experiment Farm Cottage, where they used to work out which crops were most suited to local conditions. Lancer Barracks, the oldest continuously used military establishment in Australia. And King's School for Boys, the oldest private school in Australia, opened in 1832 and based on Eton's curriculum. That was 20 years before Sydney University was inaugurated as a completely secular learning institution. That it was without religious bias is remarkable because religion played a key role in early Sydney. The townsfolk were urged to keep the Sabbath very strictly. The first church was finished in 1793, built by the Reverend Richard Johnson and paid for mainly in kind, especially rum. It was burnt down 5 years later by convicts forced to worship there. It was a Protestant church, and non-attendance was a flogging offence. Probably the most historic church in Sydney, St James, was designed as a courthouse, but converted. It was one of the churches preached in by the infamous Samuel Marsden, described by Governor Macquarie as mendacious and vindictive. Historic churches abound in Sydney. And although the current synagogue was built only late last century, Judaism established early in Sydney. In fact, the first Jew came in the First Fleet, and it wasn't long before they had a society for the burial of their dead. There wasn't a Catholic church in Sydney, Parramatta in fact, until the early 1800s, yet St Mary's is the third church built on this site. Incidentally, I want to know what happened to the spires which were meant to go above here, because I can remember vividly giving to a St Mary's Spires building collection when I was at school, more years ago than I care to remember. Still, the spires, or lack of them, didn't worry Sydney in 1970 when the bells rang out for the historic papal visit. It's hard to believe that this serene stretch of water at Sugarloaf Bay, Middle Harbour, has been one of the most deadly in Sydney. It was here we had our most recent fatal shark attack in 1963, when a young actress by the name of Marcia Hathaway died after an attack in only 75 centimetres of water. Most Sydney-siders still know how to treat even the backwaters with respect because of the number of attacks which occurred many kilometres from the sea. The explanation lies in the evolution of the harbour, which 500,000 years ago was the valley of the Parramatta River. The Ice Age changed that, and under these waters is a dead forest which gave way to a harbour, which gave birth to a city. So it was here behind me that Sydney Harbour had its beginnings.
when the ocean poured in and formed the rugged headlands. In fact, it is fair to say that Sydney Harbour starts here in the east and finishes over 30 kilometres away in the west, here at this weir behind me in central Parramatta. At least that's where the tidal influence stops and fresh water these days spills over the top to join it. Of course, this is where the surge of seawater actually finished.
The actual Parramatta River ends here at Longnose Point. Past here, Port Jackson begins. Now, although in the Sydney story we're using the term Sydney Harbour for the total body of water, it is actually contained within Port Jackson, but excludes Middle and North Harbour. So the defined Sydney Harbour is far smaller than most of us realise. Naturally, islands in the harbour are the peaks within the sunken valley. Probably the most famous is also one of the smallest, Fort Denison or Pinch Gut. Some say it was called that because in the first few weeks of settlement, convicts were left there on rations of bread and water, giving them a pinched gut. But there's also the old seafaring parlance pinch gut, meaning place where a channel narrows. The fort was begun after 2 American warships made their way up the harbour undetected in the early 1800s. Guns were mounted, but never fired in anger. It was hurriedly finished when authorities thought the Crimean War could result in a Russian invasion of Sydney. As it turned out, the threat came from the Japanese nearly 100 years later. It's hard to imagine that originally it was a favourite fishing spot for the Aborigines, and it was still that when the murderer, Francis Morgan, was hanged here.
From the gallows, Morgan declared, and in doing so probably became the first person to say, in fact probably became the last person to say so from the gallows, that he had never seen a harbour as beautiful as this from his vantage point. Now, his vantage point was in effect at about the same height as that flagstaff that you see there, although in those days it was a rock outcrop which has since been levelled off, but the gallows were set there.
Morgan certainly had time to reflect on his statement in the hereafter, because the authorities left him hanging in his vantage point for 3 years as an example to other convicts. The local Aborigines never came near the spot again. If you ever get up early enough, you'll have heard me give a cheerio on Tuyui to Pinch Gut's caretakers Cliff and June Morris. They've been living out here for 22 years, getting the fort back into shape for an average 23,000 tourists a year.
What sort of people actually use the Agricab?
Well, we have commuters, and we have people who have work around the harbour. Many tourists going to Clark Island, Shark Island, Pinch Gut, and people going for lunch. It's especially popular at the lunch times.
There were rowboat water taxis last century. Somehow I think I prefer the 1980s version. If you want simply to go across the harbour by water taxi, you're looking at about $6.50. To go down harbour to Watson's Bay or across to Manly, it's between $20 and $26. The thing water taxi operators would appreciate is more places on the harbour open to the public. I don't know if you've stopped to think about it, but places like Goat Island, Cockatoo and Garden Island are controlled by the Maritime Services Board or the Navy. The public hardly ever gets on them, so they are seen mainly by the people working there. The harbour includes not just interesting places, but valuable places. Imagine, in real estate terms, the value of Garden and Cockatoo Islands, both dockyards. The Navy would be able to afford a new fleet simply by selling up its harbour holdings and moving everything to Jervis Bay.
The GMH Lang Lang Proving Ground, where a standard Holden Gemini is clocking up 2,500 kilometres every 24 hours for 60 days and nights, non-stop, wearing out a team of 60 drivers, receiving only standard service checks, all to prove that everything they say about Gemini reliability is true. And right round Australia, in celebration of this remarkable event, your Holden dealer is offering unstoppable deals on the unstoppable Holden Gemini.
How do you feel? Big ride today, 4 TJ, and the money's on. How do you feel? The lineup's right, all is quiet, then the gates are sprung. How do you feel? Way back in the field, and only the straight to run. How do you feel? As you urge him on, thundering down the last furlong. How do you feel riding hands and heels and you know you've got 'em gone? How do you feel? How do you feel?
I feel like a two-east. I feel like a two-east. I feel like a two-east or two. I feel like a two-east. I feel like a two-east. I feel like a two-east scrap through. High life.
High light.
Stage light.
Stage light.
Night light.
Night light.
Miss light, thin light, very, very nice, nice. Flashlight.
Flashlight.
Bright light.
Bright light.
Fan light.
Fan light.
Party light.
Party light.
Miss light, salted light, very, very nice, nice.
Add a little light to your days and nights.
Moonlights, harbor lights. Smith's light, thin light, very, very nice, nice. Starlight.
Oh, Madge, what a day at the office.
He'd better fire these hands.
Oh, it's dishwashing. What can I do?
Well, everything. You can use Palmolive liquid. It's mild on hands while you do dishes. You're soaking in it.
You're putting me on.
No, I'm putting you in. Palmolive's more than mild. It makes heaps of rich suds that last and last.
Madge, I love Palmolive. You deserve a promotion.
How about cheap filing clerk? Palmolive, mild on hands while you do dishes.
We take it for granted that the harbour is kept clean, but it costs us about $1 million a year and keeps a permanent team of 25 men using 7 launches occupied all year round.
How worse things are dead cows.
Rubbish collections reports for 1982 showed items such as a raft, trees, railway sleepers, mattresses, a tractor tyre, wrecked boats, washing machines, refrigerators, even a kitchen sink. In his 37 years on the harbour, Alf Knowles estimates he's collected nearly 100 bodies.
100, I'd say. One time we used to get all the metho blokes, you know, used to sit on the steps and landings and drink their little drink and fall asleep and fall in the water. We used to, that wasn't uncommon at all.
Yeah. What's the worst side?
Oh, a young baby, I suppose. Newborn baby or stillborn baby, really.
Yeah. Did you realise what it was?
No, we thought it was a doll.
Yachting has always been #1 sport on the harbour, starting with the challenge races back in 1805 among local watermen and ship's crews. Our famous 18-footers began in Balmain, but couldn't get general acceptance, so formed a breakaway sailing group called the Sydney Flying Squadron. They raced for prize money and big bets. It was only a matter of time before larger boats became dominant in harbour conditions. That was taken a big step further in 1945 when an Englishman by the name of Captain John Illingworth talked his friends into making a pleasure trip to Hobart by yacht. The pleasure trip became a race with 9 entries, and the Sydney Hobart Classic was born.
Which made the best of conditions to lead the fleet to the head.
At the moment, Condor is definitely in the lead. She is going to go round the tug first. The spectator craft are really upset the yachts. A fantastic shot. There was
Top morning, we're just watching the brand new Manly Ferry, the Freshwater, rounding the Opera House, coming up into Sydney Cove. She's spot on time today and all sparkling in the morning sunshine, and traffic's looking pretty good down on the bridge too. Sydney, or what we came to know as Sydney, was largely explored from the waterways, and as settlements occurred, like those at Parramatta and Mossman and Manly, ferry links soon followed. As a matter of fact, our first ferry was in 1789. That was just 12 months after Arthur Phillip and his mates arrived. It was called the Rose Hill Packet, and it used to ply from Rose Hill, or was now known to us, of course, as Parramatta, into Sydney Cove to what is now the Circular Quay area. So it was set up as a ferry terminal even then.
The quay was first designed as and called Semi-Circular Quay, but the name shortened to just Circular between 1850 and 1890. And gradually it became more rectangular a shape, which has become part of our commuting habits because in the early 1900s, the wharf at the head of the cove was reserved for ferries. Now, 3 most frequented ferries are to Manly, Taronga Park Mossman and Hunters Hill. The Freshwater operates easily the most famous trip in Sydney.
It's first class. It's had its minor problems, but they've all, 99% of them have been ironed out now, and she's going well. She does a first class job. It's a first class ferry.
Do you find it as enjoyable to have a ferry controlled by a joystick, or would you like to really be back to the days of the wheel?
The days of the wheel are gone, and this, as I said, it's a difference. It's first class, and it's a pleasure to come to work on it.
It's 30 minutes across to Manly, or if you'd rather, 15 minutes by hydrofoil. The difference, apart from the speed, is nearly 1,000 passengers, 1,100 for the ferry and 150 for the foil. Either way, you often have to put up with swell inside the heads. Manly has had its ferry service since 1854, and more tourists and locals have been carried than it's possible to quantify, sometimes further than expected.
And there, beached like a 1,400-ton whale, the Freshwater stayed, an added tourist attraction for Manly Wharf. 2 hours later, and at low tide, it became clear the Freshwater wasn't going to budge, and passengers who had sat out the longest harbour trip of their life were loaded aboard a police launch and ferried to Manly Wharf.
For the tourists and locals, Manly is a mecca within Sydney. They make a beeline for the beach, which Arthur Phillip named before even seeing Sydney Cove.
Apparently, on seeing some local male Aborigines approach the boats and wade into the water unarmed, Phillip was struck with their great confidence and their manliness, and had no hesitation in naming this location Manly Cove. And that's how this suburb, perhaps one of the most famous in Sydney, got its name, Manly. There's quite a bit of controversy, as a matter of fact, as to the exact location of the landing. I'm rather in favour of the theory that they came around that point over there and sailed to this location, because in the actual log it does say that they sailed around a point, and that seems to be the logical one. As a matter of fact, it's at this location that the celebrations in Manly are held, and that once again makes me believe that this possibly is the right place. I don't know if you can see through the spray coming up from the rough weather in which we're in today, but that's the Bombora at Dobroyd Point. It was there in 1882 that a ferry came across the mast of the Pride of the Orient fleet at the time, the Australia. It had apparently just gone down right in the path of the ferry. And in 1934, over at North Head, the ferry the Barragoola collided with a whale. It didn't affect the ferry the Barragoola very much. It went on to service, as a matter of fact, until this year. We can't unfortunately say the same for the whale. It was found beached and dead just a few days later.
So, tragic or triumphant, ferries have been an invaluable form of transport in Sydney, and it is always sad to see them reach the end of the line, like the DY, for example. How many of you remember travelling on her when the colours were still green and yellow?
They all got off to a slow start.
But the oldies left can still match it with the young challengers, as we see once a year during the Festival of Sydney.
Caribee held the lead, and in light of a win in the 1981 Ferrython, it was thought she could maintain her position to the end. However, her fortunes changed dramatically during the course of the race. The 12-year-old was first across the line, a boat length ahead of Lady Cutler. She was followed by Lady McKell. Caribee, which showed so much promise in the early stages, finished second last.
Well, right on time this morning, the little passenger ferry, the Cooleen, just pulling away from the Longnose Point Wharf at Balmain and heading off upriver. She's looking great today too, and boy, there's a speedboat just ripping in behind her and heading up harbour too. Balmain itself's all a sparkle this morning as the city comes to life.
Balmain, probably more than any other suburb, has a tradition of seafarers and boatmen. That could explain why it is still seen as a town within a city, even though it's under threat from trendies. It certainly wasn't that way when it was the boyhood home to names like Billy McMahon, John Kerr, and Neville Rand.
As you know, Balmain boys don't cry.
Or the suburb which gave birth to, arguably, the world's greatest female swimmer, Dawn Fraser. Her wedding day in 1965 was one of Balmain's proudest moments. Beneath the village atmosphere, literally, is a forgotten part of Sydney. A coal mine which started operating in the 1890s, on and off until 1950. There were 2 disastrous explosions. Altogether 5 men died. The tragedies led to calls for the filling of the shafts and demolition of the colliery, and that happened in the mid-50s.
The mine itself was not a viable proposition. Actually, the surface workings were here in a property now owned by Howard Smith Industries, practically next door to the Birchgrove Primary School. The shaft ran all the way from here, right across the front of what is now a whole row of buildings, and then, would you believe, went below Sydney Harbour to a depth of 1 kilometre. And then the workings spread out beneath Goat Island and all the way across Sydney Harbour to Ball's Head. It's quite ironic, isn't it, that we're in a city which does suffer its power problems, and yet beneath us is all this raw energy. And who knows, there could be a day where we'll actually have to start digging under our city to get our coal supplies.
After all, the city of Sydney is a nuclear-free zone, which would seem to indicate that the use of this installation is out of the question. Lucas Heights Reactor. It's been a part of a simmering controversy in Sydney since its establishment in 1958.
What about Bishop?
Clean away.
When a crim boss makes a fool of Regan,
2 years of painstaking inquiries have gone down the drain. You blew it.
not even a pompous squad chief is safe from Jack's anger.
Don't underestimate Regan. He can manufacture a case. He's done it before.
I want him back. How are you going to do that? Any way I can.
Like the Mounties, the Sweeney always get their man. 9:30 Tuesday night, Channel 7.
Today, a new magazine hits the streets. The first ever all-Australian total fashion magazine. Put together by the people who really know how to put it together. Sports Girl Frontline. Hot off the presses, with news, views and clues to the hottest new looks for this summer. Frontline. It's out now. It's free. It's only at Sports Girl.
She never knew her husband had an affair. He never knew that he had a son.
It's my son, and he's going to be my son all of my life, and I am going to be his father.
Could you choose between the son you never knew you had and the family you've always loved? Man, woman, and child.
Man, Woman and Child starts Thursday at the Hoyt Centre.
As a lot of you know, I wear two hats. As a businessman, I can tell you one name in my team that's really going places. Sharp, one name for a wide range of advanced business products. Electronic typewriters, a remarkable range of highly featured copiers, electronic cash registers, professional calculators, personal and business computers. Sharp, the one name for your business team.
The first choice is Sharp.
It's the rich, rewarding 43 bean flavor that makes
Nescafe, our favorite coffee.
If it weren't for the various bridges across the harbour, Sydney would almost certainly be quite different. We tend to forget that there is far more harbour area to the west of the Harbour Bridge, with Greater Sydney's geographical centre in the Granville-Parramatta area. The bridges across Sydney Harbour are amongst the most used thoroughfares in the world, carrying about 300,000 vehicles a day into the city. Despite the enormous workload of the Sydney Harbour Bridge, it carries an average of just under 6,000 vehicles an hour. We all know that one accident on it can stop the city, but there will be no second crossing under the current government.
Well, the government has abandoned the second harbour crossing. It became too costly as a proposition in regard to upgrading existing facilities.
So at the moment, it is no. But it is worth noting that the on-again, off-again attitude is strikingly similar to the scenario before the Harbour Bridge itself was built. With